Our theme this year has been entitled, as you can see on the title slide, Becoming the Path from Here to Him. We're basing this off of Romans 8:29, where God's plan and God's purpose and God's will for all of us that claim Jesus as Lord and follow in His footsteps in every aspect of our life, to be shaped and to be molded, to be conformed to His image. That there would be less and less of us and more of Him. That His attitude would be our attitude. His way of speaking would be our way of speaking. His way of living would be our way of living. His way of treating people that He encountered would be our way of treating people when we encounter them. His beliefs would be our beliefs. His convictions would be our convictions. To be conformed from the inside out into the image of the one and only Son of God. That is God's plan for you, and that is God's plan for me. Now, for the last few months, we've been looking at a question then, is that if we are to be conformed to His image, well then who is He? Who is Jesus? Here's a question that was asked multiple times by the crowds throughout the 4 gospel accounts of His life. And it was a question asked by Jesus to His followers. Who do people say that I am? And of course, we could probably recite very close to verbatim what Peter answered in terms of that question. But for February and for March, our goal has been, instead of a human being answering that question, instead of you or I providing our own answer, why not let Jesus speak for Himself? Why not let Him answer His own question? And for the last month, we have been looking at the I am statements made by Jesus in the Gospel of John. Whether He is the bread of life or the light of the world, or as discussed last week, being the good shepherd who leads individuals who are willing to commit their lives to Him in and out of safety and good pasture and a good and abundant life. That brings us here this morning to one of the most comforting statements that Jesus will make to anybody who follows Him. But for those who are not His, it is one of the most controversial statement that He will make. It was controversial then, and it's controversial now. He stirs up a hornet's nest. He does so intentionally. Not to aggravate people, not to put them on the defensive, not even offend them just for the sake of offending, but to penetrate the human heart and the human mind that may be covered with rocks and thorns and myths and lies. So let's look at this statement, but before we get there, let's create the setting, if you will. Everything is being said in John chapter 14 is between Jesus and the 12. It is the most intimate conversation that Jesus will have, and the reason being is the night of His arrest. When it's all said and done, by the time we get to the end of John chapter 17, Jesus will be arrested in the garden. There are no crowds to hear what He's going to say. There are no rich young rulers. There are no women at the well. This is just Jesus and the 12. And we are privy to the conversation. And Jesus says to the 12 something that just shakes them. It rattles them to the core. He says in John chapter 13, verse 36, that I am going somewhere, and you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me after. And this just shakes the 12. They've committed their life. Now, you see Simon Peter is the one who has a question for Him at the beginning of this verse. Just for a moment, imagine yourself to be Peter. You have been so committed to Jesus that even though you're married, you are spending more time with Jesus on the road than you are at home. We'll later learn as the years go on that Peter becomes an elder within the congregation, which means that he has a child, or at least children. He's still more time on the road with Jesus. He's left his father's business. He's not spending time with his sibling Andrew as much as doing earthly things. This shakes Peter and others to the core that if we've done all of this, plus the fact that we love you so much that we're willing to hang on every word, and you're telling us that we can't follow you where you're about to go, that's troubling. What's going to happen? And all of this is just creating just all sorts of trouble among them. That's why Jesus says at the very beginning of chapter 14, don't let your hearts be troubled. Don't take what I'm telling you and allow it to upset the apple cart and to cause you to doubt and to question and ultimately quit. But I do have to tell you the truth. I am going somewhere, and where I'm going, you can't follow me right now. You can't do that. Coming back, but you can't follow me. And anyone who understands, who wants to kind of wrap their mind around this, it's the mother or the father, but most likely the mother who's dropping off the 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old for the first time. No, you have to stay. Mama's got to go to work. Daddy's got to go to work. No, you have to stay. Those tender moments, but it's still kind of heart-wrenching because there's that separation. Well, what do we do when trouble arises? We ask a bunch of questions. And the disciples are full of questions. They have all sorts of questions. And what I love about Jesus in the exchange is that he never gets on to them for asking the questions. He welcomes the questions. He wrestles with the questions. But he uses them to teach. So Thomas has a question. Because Jesus makes a statement that where he's going, even though they can't come at this moment and that he's going to come back, he does tell them, where I'm going, you actually know more than what you're thinking at this moment. The fear, the dread, all of that is getting the best of you, but you just need to know you know the way. And Thomas, just like any of us, what do you mean we know the way? We don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? And that's usually one of the first questions we will ask on a long trip that we're getting ready for. When we hop into the car, and hopefully after we've done our seatbelts, adjusted our mirrors, and everything else that's said, now where are we going? Let's plug in the destination so that we can know the way. It's one of the first things we want to do before we set off on that trip. Thomas just logically asked the question, we don't even know where you're going. So how can we know the way? To which Jesus says, you know the way to where I'm going. I am the way. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now I'm going to move to this next slide and then we'll back up and come to this one. The other half of this setting actually does not take place in the present. Even though Jesus has just historically and privately admitted that he is going somewhere and they can't go, and there is a real time and a real place for all of this exchange happening in this upper room where it's very quiet, it's very intimate, and they can have just this very open and honest exchange. The other thing that Jesus does within this context is that he sets everything in eternity. So here's what I need us to do this morning. I hope it is a practice for all of us to do our very best in our preparation as we meet the Lord on the first day of every week and as we meet each other, to do our very best to not use this time in our minds and our hearts to go somewhere else. That we leave the distractions, we leave the to-do list, we leave the reviewing of the week, we leave all the things that are on our plates and a preparation in heart and mind, and that we would be fully present here. I'd ask you to do that, but instead of being fully present here, I'd ask you to be fully present in eternity. No one in this room is going to live on this earth forever. That may have been the plan, but death and sin turned that all upside down. For the rest of the lesson, I would ask you to wrestle every time you feel the tug in your heart and in your mind to go somewhere else, or your belly may grumble and growl because it's getting hungry. But there's the self-discipline that you pull yourself back and that you transport yourself not in this life, but into the next one. That we are going to think, whether we're teenagers or the oldest individual in this room, that we're going to meet the Lord. That's what Jesus says. In the most comforting statement, he says, in my Father's house are many rooms, and if it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And it's beautiful, it's calming, it's peaceful. But this statement, in a very subtle but powerful way, forces me and you out of the here and now. You are not too young, and you are not too old to think about eternity. You are not poor enough or rich enough to think about eternity. Your to-do list is not big enough for you to not think about eternity. The here and now is not as important as we are led to believe, that we would not think about eternity. I would like for you to wrestle with me to maintain your heart and your mind in thinking about eternity, and specifically where you would be. I love the imagery of the Father's house, don't you? That it's not an Airbnb, that it belongs to someone else and you're only going to be there for a few days and you'll come back. The Father's house indicates just how far our God is willing to go to show us that He wants us to be part of His family. And not just us, but He wants everybody to be part of the family. The Father's house has many rooms. And I would venture to say, just as a quick reminder, remember that when God Himself came to this earth, no one found room for Him. And yet the Father makes room for anyone and everyone who is willing to come. And not only that, but the most comforting aspect for those who have entered into the waters of baptism by immersion and allowed themselves to be added by God to His family has one of the most enduring and powerful promises you will read in the New Testament, that I will come again and I will take you to myself. Where I am, you may be also. That's beautiful. And that's powerful. And that's enduring. And it strengthens the inner individual. When things are difficult and when things are hard, there is a promise that this Jesus has made to us. And it's a powerful promise. Except for one thing. That promise only belongs to Jesus. It is not found anywhere else. Which means that we got to go back to this statement. Because as comforting as that is for the majority of us, and as easy as it would have been to do a lesson based on all of that, we'll cover some of that tonight. Instead, I'd like for us to focus on this right here. This little word is the most controversial word of his statement. It was then, and it is now. Except. No exceptions. We don't like the phrase no exceptions. I'd like for exceptions to be made. I'd like exceptions to be made if I miss the deadline to send my child on a field trip. Can I send my money in late so that they can go and have a spot? Those of you that are teachers, you've probably received an email or two about that. You got to be here at a certain time. No exceptions. Can I show up at 8:05 instead of 8 o'clock, and can the door be open? Yesterday we were shopping, and Grace was using a little bit of her money to buy something, and had right there on the, well, I was going to say the register, but now it's a little pad where you just could swipe, hit your card. So not a register, just showing, I'm only 41 and we're talking about a register, and it's not even in existence anymore. But right here in bold letters, if you can imagine, this is where you would swipe your card to put it right here in the very front where everybody could see. All sales are final. You know how many conversations I overheard of someone wanting to return something, and it's right here in the middle. All sales are final. We love our choices. We love our plurality of options. We love having things being done and catered to us, whether it's online, whether it's in a store, whether it's somewhere in a restaurant. We love to be able to have a plethora of options. And in most of the case, that's a really good thing. And it's a healthy thing. Until we hear Jesus say that there are no such things when it comes to eternity as options. All sales are final. And that's difficult. Because as our society is trending downward back into a first century and prior type of mindset, where pluralism exists, and the most loving thing and the most tolerant thing and the most acceptable thing is, why there's multiple ways. Let people find their own way to God. Let people decide this. I mean, after all that matters is if we get to the Father's house. But that's difficult. That's hard. There's a push, just simply because we have been ushering God out of society for quite a while, that we realize that a void exists, and so we need to start looking for God in other places. We need to start looking for Him in other academic pursuits. So we've seen a rise in the last 10, 15, 20 years as postmodernism has come in, and as we are essentially living in a post-Christian society, why not just start looking to philosophy? Why not start looking to psychology? Why not start looking to politics? Why not start looking in all these other places? After all, wherever you find God and however you find God, that's a good thing. That should be the best thing. Except the thing is that's not where God is found. Oh, sure, they may reveal aspects of truth because all truth belongs to Him. But am I going to find it in those places? Because if I do, it's not going to be the one that fully reveals Him. After all, just short of this, and we're not going to have time, there's another disciple who will ask another question. We want you to show us the Father. You have seen the Father, he will say. Still, there's another, and this was our moment where Anne-Marie and I realized that a couple of years ago where we were not in the deep South anymore. I still consider us in the South. We know what grits and sweet tea and a couple of other things. You don't get some weird looks of far and what that may be. But the deep, deep South doesn't know much of this. And yet you've seen these and you know these. You know that there are over 4,000 cataloged world religions. Now, the majority of people on this earth, they adhere to at least the major five. Christianity, some form of it, broadly speaking. Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. And we love the idea that this bumper sticker may convey. But it doesn't work with the word accept, does it? You walk the hallways of individuals who adhere to these. You have neighbors and friends who may adhere to these certain places and thoughts. You may even work with them. And it puts us in a unique position, and we'll talk a lot more about that in terms of how we can manage that and how we can have those kinds of conversations. But there's this little thorn that Jesus just gives that just makes it difficult, doesn't it? The word accept. I don't know how many of you know what LinkedIn is. Anybody know what LinkedIn is? So a couple of years ago, and this was courtesy of Matt, he helped me. I didn't realize that they started moving into an article aspect of things. So I was a little surprised when I Googled a couple of things about this, just trying to come up with an illustration. And this was published, an article for LinkedIn was published in July of last year. The author, her name is Kim Stevens. And her little bio just says she's a broker, chief visionary, and growth expert. You want to know what the title of her article, and then I'd ask you to be patient with me because I'm going to read the whole thing. You want to know the title of her article? What if you could create your own God? Several weeks before he passed away, she begins her article, my dad and I had a very powerful conversation. He was trying to reconcile being at peace, not only in the eyes of his family and friends, but also in the eyes of God. After a lengthy conversation, and I started seeing his strength kind of waning, I finally just said to him, Dad, God can be whatever you want it to be. And he was raised in a Catholic school and had a Catholic background, but to my dad, that concept was entirely new. After some time and after, again, conversation, he thought about it. He thought about what I said, and during what would be the last remaining days of his life, he called and he told me, this is so important and this is changing everything for me. Those were some of the final words shared between us, the final gifts that were exchanged, and the final epiphanies that were reached, and I will remember them forever. I used to believe that if I didn't do the right thing, God was going to punish me, and the fear and that long entrenched belief was suddenly crippling. But beliefs can be broken, and mine shattered when someone asked me, quote, if you were to create God, what would God be? If it were your choice entirely, what would God be for you? I thought about the question and let it really sit and simmer in the most solidly formed pieces of my being. And once it settled, the question cracked those pieces wide open. The truth is that I realized this is my choice. If I believe it, then I'll see it. So when I started to say, quote, God has got my back, everything works out for me, and things are rigged in my favor, I started to experience what they really were. Because the universe is so creative, and that creativity is part of me. I got to choose how I experience life. She quotes an individual by the name of Joseph Campbell who says, in choosing your God, you choose your way of looking at the universe. There are plenty of gods. Choose yours. The God you worship is the God you deserve. Her last paragraph, came to understand that choosing my God speaks to choosing the meaning of my life. When I change what I decide my God is, the universe conspires to make it so for me. This extraordinary power can remain untapped for so many of us, but it was incredible to share my unique perspective with my father before his death. I watched it change everything for him, and I listened as he told me how a new way of looking at his God was refreshing, uplifting, and empowering all at once, just as I had imagined it would be. So to answer the question, can you create your own personal God? I'd say, you bet you can. Except, it's interesting, isn't it? Fascinating. Now, I would say that she probably stands as an extreme in terms of the thinking. But we're not too far off with the what if becoming a reality for many. And none of us here are going to believe this just simply because we want to make life miserable for other individuals. It is comforting to maybe perhaps believe that God would do that, but that's not of God at all. If Jesus is indeed God, then He has every right and all authority to say, no one comes to the Father except through me. There are no exceptions. And that is difficult, because that leads us to another group of people, and many of us probably fall into this, in the sense of goodness and sincerity and just being a decent human being. And I know I've got some faults, and I've got some cracks, and I've got some flaws, and I've got some things, but you know what? Maybe, just maybe, if I do enough on this side, I may be able to balance the scale. And goodness and sincerity and just being a decent moral individual, I could probably guarantee a spot in the Father's house. There are many of us who maybe think, even by being here this morning, that just simply a decent moral individual goes to church on Sundays. Maybe puts a little money in a plate. The whole point of this is not about what you and I can do, because as what was read for us during the communion thoughts is, no one can do anything about their own spiritual condition. There is no amount of goodness that you can participate. There's no amount of goodwill and good things that you can think of and you can believe in and that you can have a hand in that are going to balance the scales. And then the Father will let us into His house that He has prepared. There's no such thing as just simply believing only, and that'll be fine. Or maybe even going a step further. You know what? So many years ago I was baptized, and all my faith and trust was just in that water, forgetting that the faith and the trust was in the individual that I was being baptized into. What's fascinating to me about the book of Acts, and is reading this in preparation for next year, is that when Saul of Tarsus is going to make his way to gather up those who are, we know as Christians, so that he can throw them into jail, persecute them, do all sorts of things, that they were not known at that time as Christians. They were not called disciples. They didn't even refer to themselves as a church. You know what they were designated as? Those who belong to the way. You see, the thing is that for all of us here this morning, that we may have the firm conviction and belief that Jesus is indeed the only way, the question is has that translated into the rest of our life? The first century church was so committed, based on a full 110% conviction that Jesus is the only way, that the outside designation of those who see us, who hear us, who encounter us, who experience us, who share with us life, that their designation of us is the way. That's an amazing compliment given. That they see John 14 and verse 6, that I am the way, and they are so absolutely committed that they are known as the way. Less than 2 months after all the events in Jerusalem. That is an amazing aspect. My question for all of us is, even though we may look at things like this and wonder how individuals could have that, or maybe look at this and they're looking at all the wrong places, the question for us, what do we do with all of this information? Could I ask that, is your conviction that Jesus is the way, is it translating into everyday life? Is it translating that for everybody who encounters you and hears you and sees you, the way you listen to your parents or treat your teachers or fellow classmates, the way that you treat your workers, the way that you treat your fellow workers or your employees, the way you conduct yourself as a worker who is full of honesty and integrity, who's committed on the cornerstones of loving God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as you love yourself, committed to speaking the truth and speaking thankfulness and speaking love and all of those things. is the conviction that Jesus is the way translating into everyday life. Because it did for the first century church. And perhaps for some of us, it isn't. Because instead of it being just a piece of fruit of the internal reality that Jesus is Lord, we're trying to compensate and earn our way into the Father's house. No one comes to the Father except through me and your good works. No. No one comes to the Father except through me and being a decent person. No one comes to the Father except through me and being a good, moral individual. The exception is for everybody. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's one of the reasons why our theme is becoming. Because we are firmly convicted into all of this. It is controversial. It is meant to be difficult. The only way for us to go to eternity, truly go to eternity, not in our mind and not in our heart, but with our soul, is to only come to Jesus. That's it. Nowhere else. You cannot look into your own heart. You cannot look into your own mind. You cannot depend on your own good actions. It is Him and Him alone. If you're ready to become His, He is ready for you. If you're ready to take Him at His word and have the promise of redemption, salvation, and eternity, then He's the only one who can make true on that promise. If you're ready, then the only appropriate response is to arise and be baptized and wash away your sin, calling on the only way to God, Jesus Christ. If you have a need, why don't you come as we stand and sing?